There are places on Earth where time moves differently, where the rhythm of a day is measured not by clocks, but by the breathing of stone, where the ground beneath your feet carries a pulse older than memory. In the heart of Java, Indonesia, one mountain has watched over civilizations for longer than written history can trace. Its name, spoken softly by the people who live in its shadow, is the Mountain of Fire. For 400,000 years, this volcano has been restless, not in the way of youth, but with the deliberate, inexorable power of something ancient that refuses to rest. It is one of the most active volcanoes on our planet, and yet the people who live nearest to it do not flee. They remain, they plant, they build, they pray. The people of Java know this mountain well. They have planted their crops on its slopes, in soil made rich by centuries of volcanic ash. They have built their temples in its site, stone monuments to gods and ancestors who understood that some forces cannot be controlled, only respected. They have raised their children to the sound of distant rumbling, like a voice too deep to fully hear, too constant to ever forget. In the year 1006, more than a millennium ago, Merapi spoke with such force that ash fell across the entire center of Java. The eruption was recorded in ancient chronicles, written by hands that trembled as they inscribed what they had witnessed. That eruption reshaped kingdoms. It buried villages. It wrote itself into the collective memory of a people. And yet, even after that, the people returned. This is not a story of disaster. It is a story of coexistence, of adaptation, of the quiet, enduring relationship between humanity and the planet's deepest forces. By the end of 2024, Merapi had entered its fifth year of continuous eruption. Not the catastrophic, headline-making kind that empties cities in a single day. No, this was something slower, more deliberate. A gradual unfolding of molten rock that scientists monitored with instruments, and that villagers watched with something older than science. A quiet attentiveness passed down through generations, encoded into the rhythm of daily life. As the year 2025 arrived, the mountain remained awake. Steam rose from its crater-like breath in cold air. Molten lava pulsed within the summit dome, building slowly, reshaping the peak with geological patience. The dome had grown to a volume scientists estimated at over 3 million cubic meters. A slow accumulation, a pressure building, not with malice, but with the inevitability of physics. The Indonesian authorities maintained the alert level at 3, on a scale of 4. Not quite the highest warning, but close enough that no one living within 5 kilometers of the summit could claim ignorance. Close enough that evacuation routes were reviewed, supplies checked, emergency plans rehearsed in community centers and village halls. And yet, on the slopes below the exclusion zone, life continued as it had for centuries. Farmers tended their fields. Children walked to school along paths where grandparents and great-grandparents had walked before them. Markets opened at dawn, filled with voices and the smell of clove, cigarettes, and fresh earth and produce grown in soil that had been fire before it became fertility. In the evenings, families gathered. Elders told stories of previous eruptions, not with fear, but with the calm of those who have learned that some things cannot be avoided, only prepared for. They spoke of 2010, when Merapi's eruption killed hundreds and displaced thousands. They spoke of the heat that melted metal, the ash that darkened the sky for days. But they also spoke of return, of rebuilding, of the mountain giving back, eventually, what it had taken. This is the paradox of Merapi. It destroys, and yet, it sustains. But everyone knew, as 2025 unfolded, that the mountain had something to say. The instruments recorded it. The tremors beneath the surface, the gas emissions rising, the subtle inflation of the summit, the lava dome growing, slowly but steadily, like a blister on the Earth's skin. And so, the people waited. Not with panic, but with readiness. With the patience born of living alongside power you cannot command. This is a story shaped by time and patience. If you choose to remain with us, the Earth is about to reveal one of its quiet transformations.
Before we continue this story, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell the true stories of Earth's most powerful volcanoes.
To understand what was happening at Merapi in 2025, one must first understand what a volcano truly is. Not simply a mountain. Not merely a geological feature marked on maps with a small triangle and a name. A volcano is a doorway, a passage between the world we walk upon and the world that churns beneath our feet. A place where the planet's interior, normally hidden miles below the surface, finds a way to speak. The Earth, you see, is not solid. Beneath the thin crust we call home, this delicate shell of rock, no thicker, proportionally, than the skin of an apple lies, something restless. The mantle, a vast layer of rock so hot it moves like honey, flowing in great circular currents over millions of years, driven by heat rising from the planet's core. Java sits at the edge of one of the Earth's great dramas. Here, the Indo-Australian tectonic plate is sliding slowly, inexorably, beneath the Sunder plate. This collision happens at the speed fingernails grow, yet the forces involved are beyond human comprehension. As one plate dives beneath another, it carries with it ocean sediment, water trapped in rock, material that has never known heat. And then, at depths of 60 miles or more, the descending plate begins to melt. Water, released from the subducting rock, lowers the melting point of the surrounding mantle. Magma forms. Not the heavy, dark magma of places like Hawaii, but something different. Something lighter. Something rich in silica and gas, thick like porridge, resistant to flow. This magma is dangerous precisely because it does not move easily. It rises slowly through cracks in the overlying rock, accumulating in chambers, building pressure like steam in a sealed pot. And when it finally reaches the surface, it does not flow gently. It explodes. It shatters. It sends clouds of superheated gas and pulverized rock racing down mountainsides faster than any human can run. This is the nature of Merapi. This is why, among Indonesia's 130 active volcanoes, Merapi holds a particular reputation. Its eruptions are not predictable rivers of lava that one can walk away from. They are sudden, violent releases of energy that have claimed thousands of lives across recorded history. And yet, understanding this does not make the mountain an enemy. It makes it a fact. A condition of existence. Like winter, like drought, like the turning of seasons. The Javanese have a word for this understanding. They call it rimo, acceptance. Not passive resignation, but active accommodation. A recognition that some forces are simply woven into the fabric of life, and wisdom lies not in fighting them, but in learning to live alongside them with open eyes. By January 2025, the lava dome at Merapi's summit had reached a critical size. Scientists at the monitoring station in Yogyakarta watched the data streams with calm vigilance. Seismometers recorded hundreds of small earthquakes, each day a signature of magma moving through cracks, of rock fracturing under pressure, of a mountain adjusting to the forces building within it. Gas sensors detected increasing emissions of sulfur dioxide, a clear sign that fresh magma was rising from depth, bringing with it the dissolved gases that would eventually power an eruption. Thermal cameras showed the dome glowing at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. And yet, to the untrained eye standing in the villages below, the mountain looked almost peaceful. Steam rose from the summit. Occasionally, a small avalanche of rock would tumble down the upper slopes, glowing orange in the night. But nothing that spoke of imminent catastrophe. This is the difficulty with volcanoes. They do not announce their intentions clearly. They whisper in the language of tremors and gases, a language that requires instruments and expertise to interpret. And even then, even with all our modern technology and understanding, they remain fundamentally unpredictable. We can say that an eruption is likely. We cannot say when. We can map the zones of greatest danger. We cannot guarantee where the mountain's fury will focus. We can evacuate populations and save lives. But we cannot stop what is already in motion deep beneath the surface. The Earth will have its say. And so, as the first months of 2025 unfolded, the mountain and the people who watched it entered a familiar dance. Scientists issued updates. Authorities reviewed emergency plans. Villages within the exclusion zone remained empty, homes abandoned to the mountain's whims. And further down the slopes, in the villages just beyond the danger zone, life continued with a patience born of centuries. The farmers knew that the ash, when it came, would eventually enrich their soil. The merchants knew that tourists would return when the mountain quieted, drawn by the spectacle of an active volcano. The elders knew that their grandchildren would tell stories of this eruption to their own grandchildren someday. This was not the first time. It would not be the last. The mountain was simply doing what mountains like Merapi do: breathing, building, preparing to release what it had gathered within itself. And the people, in turn, were doing what people do: watching, waiting, enduring. February arrived with the rains. Across Java, the monsoon season brought its annual gift of water, filling the rice paddies, swelling the rivers, washing the volcanic ash from previous months into the soil where it would nourish the next harvest. The farmers welcomed the rain, as they always had. But they also watched the mountain more carefully during these months. Water and volcanoes are a dangerous combination. When rain falls on hot volcanic rock, it does not simply evaporate. It seeps into cracks. It percolates downward through layers of loose ash and fractured stone. And when it encounters heat of a lava dome, the heat of fresh magma near the surface, it flashes instantly to steam. The pressure builds in confined spaces, and what was stable becomes unstable. The scientists monitoring Merapi understood this well. They had seen it before, in previous eruptions: rain triggering sudden collapses of the lava dome, avalanches of hot rock cascading down the mountainside, mixing with water to create lahars-deadly mudflows that could travel for miles, burying everything in their path beneath a concrete-like mixture of ash, rock, and water. In early February, the seismic activity changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm the general public. But to the trained observers studying the readouts, the shift was unmistakable. The earthquakes were growing slightly stronger, slightly more frequent, the intervals between them shortening. The mountain was not resting anymore. It was stirring. On February 10th, a series of small pyroclastic flows descended the southwestern flank of the volcano. Clouds of superheated gas and pulverized rock tumbled down the slope for nearly 2 kilometers, leaving a gray scar across the vegetation. The flows occurred at night, visible as orange rivers of incandescence to anyone watching from the observation posts. No one was injured. The flows stayed well within the exclusion zone. But the event was significant nonetheless. It meant the lava dome was becoming unstable, growing too large, too steep, unable to support its own weight. Pieces were breaking off, collapsing, releasing the tremendous heat trapped within. This was the pattern Merapi followed. Not one single cataclysmic explosion, but a series of smaller events. A stuttering release of pressure, each collapse sending a pulse of hot material down the mountain. each event potentially growing larger than the last. The alert level remained at 3, but the language in the official reports shifted slightly. From elevated activity to increased unrest, from ongoing monitoring to heightened vigilance, the villages just beyond the exclusion zone received visitors from the Disaster Management Agency. Professional men and women who reviewed evacuation routes, checked emergency supplies, reminded families where to go if the sirens sounded. They did not speak of panic. They spoke of preparedness. And the villagers listened as they had listened before. Some families began quietly moving valuables to relatives. Homes further away, photographs, documents, small heirlooms that could not be replaced. Not because they expected disaster, but because they understood that possibility and probability are different things. Merapi might quiet down again, as it had done before, or it might not. Wisdom lay in being ready for either outcome. In the markets, the talk turned more frequently to the mountain. Old stories were retold. The eruption of 2010 was remembered in vivid detail, the heat, the darkness, the ash that fell like snow for days, but also the resilience that followed. The rebuilding, the return. One elderly man, selling vegetables grown on the volcanic slopes, spoke to a visiting journalist with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the weather. "The mountain gives, and the mountain takes," he said, arranging tomatoes in neat rows. "This is how it has always been. This is how it will always be. We do not control it. We simply live with it." The journalist asked if he was afraid. The old man paused, considering the question carefully. "Fear is not the right word," he said finally. "Respect, yes. Caution, yes, but fear. Fear would mean wanting to be somewhere else, and where else would I go? This is my home. This soil fed my parents, and their parents before them. The mountain is part of that. You do not fear your own home." By the end of February, the lava dome had grown another 50,000 cubic meters. The summit was reshaping itself daily, building higher, growing more unstable. At night, the glow from the crater was visible from Yogyakarta, 30 kilometers away, a dull orange pulse against the dark sky, like a coal that never quite went out. Tourists still came, despite the warnings, or perhaps because of them. They filled the hotels in the safe zones, rising before dawn to photograph the mountain from designated viewpoints. They marveled at the smoke, the occasional bright streak of falling rock, the raw evidence that the earth beneath their feet was not the solid, passive thing we pretend it is. For them, Merapi was a spectacle, a photo opportunity, a story to tell when they returned home. For the people living on its slopes, it was something else entirely. It was a presence, a companion, a force that shaped every decision, every plan, every conversation, not with malice, but with the simple weight of being what it was, a volcano. Ancient and active, following laws written into stone billions of years before the first human ever looked upon it. March arrived, and with it, a subtle change in the air. The rains began to ease. The sky cleared more often. And the mountain, patient as ever, continued its slow accumulation of pressure. The question was no longer if something would happen. The question was when, and how large it would be when it came. There is a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be learned from books. It is the knowledge that comes from watching, from listening, from paying attention to subtle changes that instruments might miss, or that data might not capture in quite the right way. The people who lived closest to Merapi possessed this knowledge. They knew, for instance, that when the birds grew quieter in the mornings, the mountain was often more active. They knew that certain smells on the wind, sulfur, yes, but also something else. Something acrid and mineral, meant fresh magma was near the surface. They knew that when the small streams running down from the upper slopes turned warmer, or when their flow changed unexpectedly, it was worth paying attention. This was not superstition. It was pattern recognition refined across generations. It was the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned to read the mountain the way sailors learned to read the sea. The scientists respected this knowledge, even as they relied on their instruments. At the Merapi monitoring station, a dedicated team worked in shifts around the clock. They watched seismograph traces scroll across computer screens, each line a record of the Earth's trembling. They analyzed gas samples collected by brave technicians who climbed partway up the mountain wearing protective gear and carrying specialized equipment. They studied thermal images captured by satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above. But they also talked to the villagers. They asked the farmers what they had noticed. They listened when the elders mentioned something unusual. Science and traditional knowledge were not in conflict here. They were complementary ways of understanding the same phenomena: mountain preparing to release the pressure building within it. By mid-March, both the instruments and the observers were in agreement. Something was changing. The character of the seismic activity had shifted again. The earthquakes were no longer random and scattered. They were organizing themselves into patterns. Swarms of small tremors would occur in rapid succession, then fall silent for hours, then resume. This was a sign that magma was moving more actively through the plumbing system beneath the volcano, forcing its way through obstacles, creating new pathways upward. The summit crater, observed through high-powered telescopes from the monitoring station, showed visible changes. Cracks had appeared in the lava dome. Steam vents that had been dormant for weeks suddenly roared back to life. And at night, the incandescence visible through those cracks suggested that the magma inside was rising closer to the surface, heating the dome from within. The authorities quietly began preparing for the possibility of a larger eruption. Emergency shelters were inspected and restocked. Medical teams reviewed their protocols for treating burns and respiratory injuries from volcanic ash. Schools in the surrounding districts conducted evacuation drills, teaching children where to go and what to bring if they needed to leave quickly. None of this was done with alarm. It was methodical, professional, the kind of preparation that saves lives not through panic, but through practiced calm. In the villages, families held quiet conversations. If the alert level was raised to 4, the highest evacuation would be mandatory. 4 areas within a certain radius of the summit. That meant leaving homes, livestock, everything that could not be carried. It meant staying in temporary shelters for days, possibly weeks, until the mountain quieted again. Some families had been through this before. They knew what to pack: important documents in waterproof bags, medicine, a change of clothes, photos and small mementos, food and water for the first few days. Everything else would have to be left to fate. Others, younger families, listened to advice from their elders. They prepared bags and placed them by their doors. They identified which relatives living further away could take them in if needed. They explained to their children, in calm voices, that if the sirens sounded, they would need to leave quickly and without complaint. The children, for their part, seemed less worried than the adults. To them, the mountain was simply part of the landscape. It had always been there. It glowed at night sometimes. It rumbled occasionally, but it was as familiar as the rice paddies or the distant city lights. The idea that it could be dangerous seemed abstract, theoretical, like a story from a book rather than an immediate reality. This was both a blessing and a concern. Children who were not afraid would follow instructions more easily during an evacuation, but they might also be tempted to take risks, to look back when they should be running forward, to return for a forgotten toy, to treat the whole thing as an adventure rather than an emergency. The adults knew better. They remembered the heat, the choking ash, the impossible speed of the pyroclastic flows. They remembered friends and neighbors who had not made it out in time during previous eruptions. And so they prepared, quietly and thoroughly, while trying not to transmit their anxiety to the younger generation. On March 23rd, the mountain offered a reminder of what it was capable of. Just after midnight, a portion of the lava dome collapsed. The event lasted less than 3 minutes, but in that brief span, approximately 100,000 cubic meters of rock, heated to temperatures that would melt steel, tumbled down the southwestern flank of the volcano. The collapse generated a pyroclastic flow that traveled nearly 4 kilometers, moving at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. The sound was heard in villages 10 kilometers away, a deep rumbling, like continuous thunder, followed by silence. When dawn came, the destruction was visible. A fresh grey scar cut through the vegetation on the upper slopes. Trees that had stood for decades were simply gone, snapped off at their base or buried entirely. The flow had stopped just short of the exclusion zone boundary, but the message was clear. The mountain was not playing. This was not theater. This was physics and chemistry manifesting at a scale that rendered human wishes irrelevant. The monitoring team issued an updated report. The language remained calm, but the content was unambiguous. The lava dome was highly unstable. Further collapses were likely. Larger events were possible, possibly imminent. The alert level was raised to 4. Mandatory evacuation orders were issued for all areas within 8 kilometers of the summit. The sirens began to sound at dawn on March 24th, and the people, who had been preparing for this possibility since February, began to move. Calmly, orderly, with the practiced efficiency of those who understood that cooperation, not panic, was what would keep everyone safe. They locked their doors, knowing they might return to find nothing. They looked back at their homes, committing them to memory, and then they walked away, carrying what they could, leaving the rest to the mountain. There is a particular silence that comes when thousands of people leave their homes at once. Not the silence of emptiness, exactly, but the absence of the sounds that make a place feel alive. No children playing in yards. No motorcycles starting up for the morning commute. No vendors calling out their wares. No dogs barking. No roosters announcing the dawn. Just the wind moving through abandoned streets and the distant rumble of a mountain preparing to speak. The evacuation unfolded with the calm precision of something that had been rehearsed many times, even though no rehearsal can fully prepare you for the reality of leaving everything behind. Families walked down mountain paths carrying bundles on their backs and children in their arms. The elderly were helped into trucks and buses that had been mobilized from districts across the region. Livestock were herded down to lower elevations. Though many animals would have to be left behind, there was simply no way to move them all in time. The evacuation centers had been prepared for days. Schools, community halls, and sports complexes in Yogyakarta and surrounding towns were transformed into temporary shelters. Mattresses were laid out in rows. Supplies of rice, cooking oil, and clean water were stockpiled. Medical stations were set up with volunteers trained in basic first aid and trauma response. By the afternoon of March 24th, more than 20,000 people had been moved out of the danger zone. They came with what they could carry. Plastic bags stuffed with clothes, boxes of important documents, photographs carefully wrapped in cloth. Some brought nothing but the clothes on their backs, having made the calculation that time was more valuable than possessions. At the evacuation centers, volunteers worked tirelessly to register families, assign them spaces, distribute meals, aid organizations that had been through this drill before because Merapi had erupted many times, arrived with experienced staff who knew how to manage large displaced populations with dignity and efficiency. The atmosphere in the shelters was not one of despair. It was something more complex. There was anxiety, certainly. The uncertainty of not knowing when they could return home, or what condition their homes would be in when they did. There was frustration at the disruption, the loss of income for those who worked daily jobs, the interruption of school for the children. But there was also something else, a sense of shared experience, of community cohesion forged through collective challenge. Families who had evacuated together before greeted each other like old companions reuniting. "Ah, we meet again under the mountain's shadow," they would say, with smiles that carried both humor and resignation. Stories were shared. Food was divided without hesitation. Those with extra blankets gave them to those without. Those who had evacuated many times before offered advice and comfort to those going through it for the first time. This was not merely crisis response. This was culture. This was the accumulated social capital of a people who had learned that survival depends not on individual strength, but on collective resilience. Meanwhile, on the mountain itself, the scientific monitoring continued. The evacuation had cleared the danger zone of civilians, but small teams of volcanologists and emergency personnel remained at carefully calculated distances, maintaining the instruments that provided the data everyone depended on. These were not reckless individuals. They were professionals who understood risk assessment, who knew exactly how far they could go and when they needed to retreat. They wore helmets and carried respirators. They communicated constantly with the main monitoring station. They moved quickly and efficiently, checking seismometers, replacing gas sensors, ensuring that the flow of information would not be interrupted even as the mountain grew more dangerous. Their work was essential. Without real-time data, evacuation decisions would be based on guesswork. Lives would be at greater risk. So they stayed at the edge of the danger zone, recording the mountain's vital signs as it prepared for whatever would come next. And the mountain continued its slow, inexorable progression toward release. Throughout late March, the lava dome continued to grow. More collapses occurred, each one sending pyroclastic flows racing down the southwestern flank. The flows were becoming larger, traveling farther. The exclusion zone boundaries were adjusted accordingly, pushing the perimeter of safety outward. Additional evacuations were ordered. More families left their homes. By the end of March, nearly 30,000 people had been displaced. In the evacuation centers, a routine began to establish itself. Children attended makeshift classes organized by volunteer teachers. Adults formed committees to manage food distribution, sanitation, and conflict resolution. Religious leaders held services and offered counseling to those struggling with the stress of displacement. Time took on a different quality in the shelters. Days were measured not by work schedules or school routines, but by meals, by updates from the monitoring station, by the quality of news from the mountain. Every evening, officials would address the evacuees with the latest information. Seismic activity levels, gas emission readings, visual observations, estimated timelines, always delivered with appropriate caveats. Volcanoes do not follow schedules. They follow physics. And every evening, after the briefings, families would discuss what they had heard. Some found comfort in the data. Numbers and graphs made the situation feel manageable, comprehensible. Others found the uncertainty maddening. How could modern science, with all its instruments and expertise, not know when the eruption would happen? But the scientists monitoring Merapi were honest about the limits of their knowledge. They could measure what was happening. They could identify trends. They could make educated estimates about probabilities. But they could not predict the exact moment when the mountain would cross the threshold from restless to explosive. No one could Then so, the waiting continued. Stories like this are not meant to be rushed. They are meant to be followed by those who still listen. If this journey resonates with you, you are already part of Fury of the Earth. The people in the shelters waited with a patience born of necessity. The scientists at their monitoring stations waited with instruments poised and protocols ready. The emergency responders waited with vehicles fueled and routes mapped. And the mountain, indifferent to all of it, continued doing what mountains like Merapi do: building pressure, accumulating force, moving toward the inevitable moment when what had been contained could no longer be held. April arrived with clear skies and warming temperatures. The dry season was beginning. The rains that had saturated the mountain in February and March were tapering off. Under different circumstances, this would have been welcome news. Easier conditions for monitoring, better visibility, less risk of lahars. But it also meant something else. It meant that when the eruption came, there would be less water to moderate it, less moisture to absorb heat. The pyroclastic flows would be hotter, faster, more capable of traveling long distances. The waiting was becoming harder, not because conditions were worsening dramatically, but because human beings are not built for sustained uncertainty. We want resolution. We want to know what happens next. We want the story to move forward. But the mountain operated on geological time, not human time. And so the people endured. They adapted. They found ways to maintain normalcy within the abnormal. They told stories. They shared meals. They cared for one another. And they watched the horizon, where Merapi stood against the sky, smoking and glowing and preparing to remind everyone within sight of a fundamental truth: that we are guests on this planet, not masters, that the Earth will have its say, regardless of our schedules or preferences, that some forces can only be witnessed, never controlled. The mountain chose April 7th, not because of any human calendar or significance, not in response to prayers or scientific predictions, simply because on that day, the internal architecture of Merapi accumulated pressure, the weight of the lava dome, the structural integrity of fractured rock, reached a point where the laws of physics demanded release. It began at 4:37 in the morning. The seismographs recorded it first. A sudden spike in activity. Not the gradual build-up that had characterized the previous weeks, but an abrupt intensification. The tremors changed character from discrete events separated by intervals to a continuous signal, what volcanologists call harmonic tremor. The signature of magma moving rapidly, forcefully, through the volcano's internal plumbing. At the monitoring station, alarms sounded. Night shift personnel who had been watching screens with patient vigilance suddenly moved with urgent purpose. Protocols were activated. Communications went out to emergency response teams, to district authorities, to the evacuation centers. The mountain was no longer preparing. It was acting. Within minutes, the summit cameras, those still functioning in the harsh environment near the crater, captured what was happening. The lava dome was not simply collapsing in sections anymore, it was disintegrating. Massive portions of the structure, weakened by internal heat and undermined by rising magma, were failing catastrophically. And as the dome collapsed, it exposed what lay beneath. Fresh magma, pressurized, gas-rich, superheated to temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius. The effect was immediate and violent. A column of ash and gas erupted from the summit, punching upward into the pre-dawn darkness with tremendous force. Within seconds, it had reached a height of 5 kilometers. Within minutes, it was visible from Yogyakarta, a dark pillar rising against the lightning eastern sky, illuminated from within by pulses of volcanic lightning, electrical discharges generated by the friction of ash particles, colliding at high velocity. But the vertical eruption column, dramatic as it was not the primary danger. The real threat came from what could not rise. When the lava dome collapsed, it released an enormous volume of material that was too heavy, too dense to be carried upward by the eruption column. This material fragmented rock, pulverized lava, superheated gas went where gravity directed it. Down pyroclastic flows poured from the summit in multiple directions. These were not the relatively modest flows that had occurred in previous weeks. These were currents of destruction, moving at speeds approaching 200 kilometers per hour. Rivers of material heated to temperatures that would ignite wood on contact, that would boil water instantly, that would reduce any living thing in their path to ash within seconds. The flows raced down the southwestern flank, the direction most of the previous activity had taken, but they also surged down the southern and western slopes, following valleys and ravines with the fluid dynamics of avalanches but with heat that defied imagination. The sound was unlike anything the monitoring teams had heard before. A roar, a continuous, overwhelming noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not sharp, like an explosion. Deeper, more fundamental. The sound of immense quantities of material in violent motion. The sound of the Earth's interior being exposed to the atmosphere. The evacuation had saved thousands of lives. The areas now being devastated by pyroclastic flows were empty of people. The homes, the temples, the small villages that lay in the paths of destruction had been abandoned days earlier. And so, when the flows arrived, tearing through buildings, incinerating vegetation, burying roads under meters of hot debris, there were no human casualties. This was the triumph of preparation, of taking scientific warnings seriously, of communities and governments working together to move people out of harm's way before disaster struck. But it was also a sobering reminder of what had been sacrificed. Those empty homes were not just structures, they were people's lives, their histories, the places where children had been born, where marriages had been celebrated, where generations of families had gathered, and they were gone now, reduced to rubble and ash, buried under materials so hot it would remain dangerous for days. The eruption continued through the morning. Wave after wave of pyroclastic flows descended the mountain. The eruption column, sustained by the continuous release of gas and fragmented magma, rose higher 8 kilometers, 10 kilometers, eventually reaching 15 kilometers into the atmosphere. At that altitude, the ash and gas spread outward, forming the characteristic anvil shape of a major volcanic eruption. A cloud that would eventually extend for hundreds of kilometers downwind. Ash began to fall across central Java, first as a fine dusting, barely noticeable except as a grayish haze on surfaces. Then more heavily, by mid-morning, areas 30 kilometers from the volcano were experiencing ashfall, thick enough to accumulate on roads, to coat vehicles, to reduce visibility. By afternoon, some areas were receiving several centimeters of ash, enough to collapse weak roofs, to contaminate water supplies, to make breathing difficult for anyone without protective masks. The evacuees in the shelters could see the eruption column from their locations. They stood outside, despite the ash beginning to fall even in Yogyakarta, and watched their mountain transform the sky. The emotions were complex. Relief that they were safe, grief for what was being lost, awe at the sheer scale of what they were witnessing. And underneath it all, a kind of numb acceptance. This was Merapi doing what Merapi does. This was the price, periodically extracted, for living on such fertile ground. Some wept quietly. Others stood in silence, arms around family members, watching the dark column rise and spread. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. Will our house still be there? Can we go back tomorrow? Why is the mountain so angry? The mountain was not angry. Anger implies intention, emotion, choice. The mountain was simply following the imperatives written into its geological nature. It had accumulated magma and gas and pressure until the containing structures could no longer hold, and now it was releasing what it had gathered, indifferent to the consequences for the small, temporary beings who had built their lives on its slopes. By evening, the intensity of the eruption had begun to diminish. The pyroclastic flows were smaller, less frequent. The eruption column was still rising from the summit, but not with the same violence as the morning. The seismic data suggested that the initial release of pressure had been achieved. The system was beginning to stabilize, at least temporarily. But the mountain was not finished. Eruptions like this rarely consist of a single event. More commonly, they proceed in phases. An initial explosive release, followed by a period of relative quiet, followed by additional pulses as more magma rises to fill the void left by what was expelled. The scientists monitoring the activity warned that further eruptions were likely in the coming days. Perhaps not as large as what had occurred on April 7th, but still dangerous. Still capable of generating pyroclastic flows that could travel kilometers from the summit. The evacuation orders would remain in place. No one would be returning home yet. In the shelters that night, there was less conversation than usual. People were exhausted, not from physical exertion but from the emotional toll of watching their world transform, of seeing the mountain they had lived beside, worked beside, prayed to, reveal its capacity for destruction. But there was also something else beginning to emerge. Something quieter but no less significant. A recognition that they had survived. That the preparations had worked. That the community had held together under pressure. That they would, eventually, rebuild. Because that is what people do. That is what the people of Java have done after every eruption in living memory and in the centuries before that. The mountain gives, and the mountain takes. And life, somehow, continues. The days following April 7th unfolded in a haze of grey. Ash covered everything. It coated roads and rooftops, clogged drainage systems, infiltrated homes even through closed windows. In Yogyakarta, residents wore masks when they ventured outside. Schools closed. The airport suspended operations. Daily life contracted into the immediate task of managing the fallout from a mountain 30 kilometers away. But in the evacuation centers, a different kind of work was beginning. Damage assessment teams, equipped with protective gear and air quality monitors, began cautiously approaching the areas that had been devastated by the pyroclastic flows. What they found confirmed what the monitoring data had suggested. The destruction within the flow paths was total. Buildings reduced to foundations. Forests stripped to bare earth. Everything organic incinerated. Everything combustible consumed. Yet even in the midst of this devastation, there were boundaries. Sharp lines where the flows had stopped, leaving untouched vegetation standing meters away from complete destruction. This was the nature of pyroclastic flows, utterly devastating within their paths, but confined by topography, following valleys and channels with fluid precision. The photographs and video footage were sobering. They were also necessary. Communities needed to see what had happened, to understand the scale of what had been avoided through evacuation, to begin processing what came next. By mid-April, the eruption had entered a new phase. Not the explosive violence of April 7th, but a sustained period of dome building and smaller collapses. The volcano was still active, still dangerous, but in a more predictable pattern. Fresh magma continued to rise, building a new dome in the crater. Periodically, portions would collapse, generating pyroclastic flows similar to those that had occurred before the major eruption. The authorities maintained the evacuation orders for the immediate danger zone. but began allowing limited returns to areas further from the summit. Families could visit their homes, those that remained to assess damage and retrieve belongings, but could not stay overnight. The returns were emotional. Some found their homes intact, covered in ash but structurally sound. They wept with relief, began the work of cleaning, of reclaiming their lives from the grey coating that covered everything. Others found nothing, empty lots where homes had stood, familiar landmarks erased. They stood in silence, trying to reconcile memory with the transformed landscape before them. And slowly, painfully, the work of recovery began. Aid organizations mobilized resources. The government announced reconstruction assistance. International support arrived from countries that understood volcanic disasters, that had been through similar experiences themselves. But recovery is not simply a matter of rebuilding structures. It is about restoring livelihoods, re-establishing communities, helping people process trauma and loss. It is work that takes years, not weeks. The farmers faced particular challenges. The ash that covered their fields was both curse and blessing. In the short term, it was toxic to crops, disrupting the growing season. But in the long term, once weathered and mixed with soil, it would become fertilizer. The volcanic material that had buried this year's harvest would nourish future harvests. This had always been the paradox of Merapi. By late April, some families were beginning to return permanently to areas deemed safe. Others remained in evacuation centers, their homes either destroyed or still within zones considered too dangerous for habitation. The shelters, which had been emergency facilities, were becoming semi-permanent communities, requiring different management and resources. Children adapted, as children do. They attended the makeshift schools in the shelters. They played in courtyards covered with ash. They incorporated the eruption into their games and drawings, processing their experience through imagination and play. The adults worked to maintain normalcy amid ongoing uncertainty. They organized communal meals. They held meetings to discuss collective needs. They supported those struggling most with displacement and loss. And through it all, the mountain remained visible on the horizon, still smoking, still glowing at night, still very much alive. A reminder that this chapter had closed, but the story was far from over. That Merapi would erupt again someday. That the cycle would repeat. That the choice facing each generation was not whether to live with this reality, but how. In a modest building on the outskirts of Yogyakarta, scientists continued their watch. The eruption of April 7th had not ended their work. In many ways, it had only intensified it. Understanding what had happened, documenting the event in detail, analyzing the data, this was how knowledge accumulated. This was how future eruptions might be better predicted. Future evacuations better timed. The monitoring station for Merapi was equipped with an array of instruments that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. Seismometers sensitive enough to detect tremors too small for human perception. Gas sensors that could measure sulfur dioxide concentrations in parts per million. Thermal cameras that could detect temperature changes on the summit from kilometers away. GPS stations that could measure the inflation or deflation of the volcano with millimeter precision. All of this technology served a single purpose: to listen to what the mountain was saying. Because volcanoes do speak in their own language. The challenge is learning to interpret that language correctly. A swarm of small earthquakes might mean magma is rising, or it might mean nothing significant. Increased gas emissions could signal an imminent eruption, or simply a change in the permeability of rock near the surface. The art of volcanology lies in recognizing patterns, in understanding context, in knowing which signals matter and which are merely noise. The scientists studying Merapi had decades of data to work with. Every eruption was an opportunity to refine their models, to test their assumptions, to learn. And the 2025 eruption had provided valuable insights. The evacuation had been successful because the warning signs had been read correctly. The gradual increase in seismic activity, the growth of the lava dome, the changes in gas emissions all had pointed toward a major event. The timing had been uncertain, but the probability had been clear enough to justify moving people to safety. This was the triumph of modern volcanology. Not the ability to prevent eruptions, which remains impossible, but the ability to forecast them well enough to save lives. Yet the scientists also understood the limits of their knowledge. Volcanoes are complex systems, influenced by variables that cannot always be measured or predicted. Two eruptions from the same volcano can follow entirely different patterns. What worked as a warning sign once might not work the next time. Humility, in volcanology, is not optional. It is essential. By May, the eruption had settled into a pattern of lower intensity activity. The lava dome continued to grow slowly. Small collapses still occurred, generating pyroclastic flows that stayed within the established danger zones. The volcano was being watched as carefully as ever, but the acute crisis phase had passed. Plans were being made for long-term monitoring improvements. Additional seismometers would be installed. The gas monitoring network would be expanded. Satellite surveillance would be enhanced. Each eruption taught lessons that could be applied to future preparedness. But technology alone was not enough. The relationship between scientists and local communities remained crucial. The instruments could detect changes in the mountain's behavior, but the people living on its slopes could notice things the instruments might miss. A successful monitoring system required both the precision of modern science and the accumulated wisdom of generations. International collaboration was also expanding. Volcanologists from Japan, the United States, Italy, and other countries with active volcanoes came to study Merapi, to share techniques, to learn from Indonesia's experience. Volcanic disasters respected no borders, and the knowledge gained from one eruption could save lives halfway around the world. The work was painstaking, technical, often invisible to the public, but it was essential. Every data point collected, every model refined, every protocol improved, all of it contributed to a global effort to understand and coexist with one of nature's most powerful forces. Because humanity was not leaving volcanic regions. Too many people lived near active volcanoes. The soil was too fertile, the locations too strategic, the cultural connections too deep. The only viable path forward was learning to live more safely with the reality of volcanic hazards. And that required science, investment, and commitment across generations. The mountain would erupt again. Of that, there was no doubt. The question was whether humanity would be ready when it did. By the end of 2025, life on the slopes of Merapi had found a new equilibrium. Not the old normal that was gone, transformed by the events of April, but a different normal, shaped by loss and adaptation and the quiet resilience that defines communities who understand that some forces cannot be defeated, only accommodated. Reconstruction continued. New homes rose where old ones had stood, built with improved designs informed by what the eruption had taught. Ash had been cleared from fields, and the first crops planted in the enriched soil were showing promise. Children had returned to schools, carrying memories of displacement, but also moving forward, as children must. The evacuation centers had emptied. The last families had found permanent housing, either in rebuilt homes or in new locations further from the danger zones. The shelters were cleaned and returned to their original purposes, ready to be activated again if needed. because they would be needed again, eventually. Merapi itself remained active through the year. The lava dome continued to grow, periodically shedding material in small collapses. Seismic activity persisted at levels above the long-term baseline. The monitoring station maintained its constant vigilance, recording every tremor, every gas emission, every subtle change in the mountain's behavior. Tourists returned. They came to witness an active volcano, to stand at safe viewpoints and photograph the smoking summit, to feel the visceral reminder that the earth beneath their feet is not the stable, passive platform we often imagine it to be. For them, Merapi was spectacle. For the people who lived in its shadow, it was something more fundamental. It was context. It was the defining feature of their landscape, their culture, their understanding of what it means to be human in a world shaped by forces vastly larger than ourselves. The relationship between people and volcano had been tested in 2025, as it had been tested many times before. And once again, it had held. Not because the mountain had become less dangerous, but because the people had proven capable of responding to danger with preparation, cooperation, and grace under pressure. There is a particular kind of wisdom that comes from living with uncertainty, an acceptance that safety is never absolute, that plans must always include the possibility of disruption, that community and mutual support are not optional luxuries but essential foundations of survival. The people of Java possessed this wisdom. They carried it in their stories, their traditions, their practiced responses to volcanic hazards, and they would pass it to the next generation, as it had been passed to them. The mountain, for its part, remained indifferent to human concerns. It followed the laws written into rock and heat and pressure. It would erupt again when those laws demanded it. It would reshape the landscape again. It would test again the resilience of those who chose to live nearby. This was not malice. This was simply nature. And understanding that distinction between an enemy to be fought and a force to be respected was perhaps the deepest wisdom of all. As the year drew to a close, Merapi stood against the tropical sky much as it had for 400,000 years. Smoking, glowing, at night, very much alive. A reminder that we are participants in a story far older and longer than any individual human life. That the planet will continue its ancient rhythms long after we are gone. That our task is not to control these forces, but to learn to walk beside them with open eyes and humble hearts. The mountain endures, and so do the people. The planet will continue its ancient rhythm long after we are gone. If you wish to keep walking beside these powerful forces, subscribe to Fury of the Earth, and join us in the next chapter of the planet's unfolding story.